I would like to leave the floor to Fabio right now. Fabio is a Deputy Director, Money and Capital Market at the IMF, and is a co-chair of the workstream on bridging the data gap, who just recently published a report, I think it was last May. Fabio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me spend a few minutes describing a little bit the background for the NGFS report. So the workstream has been set up July of last year in following a recommendation number 3 of the first NGFS comprehensive report back in April 19. It's co-chaired by myself and Patrick Amis from the ECB. And we have 3 teams led by Justin Dijk from the Dutch Central Bank, Guan Schalkens from the ECB, and Elena Tripstorn from the Bundesbank. And these 3 teams focus essentially on market data, micro data, and macro data. And we have organized the work around essentially 3 phases. One where we identify data needs, one where we focus on data availability, then implicitly that gives you the data gaps, climate data gaps, and the policy recommendation on how to close those gaps. And comparable data are crucial for financial sector stakeholders, that include private sector and public sector, to assess financial stability risk, properly manage climate risk, as well as price climate risk, as well as to taking advantage of opportunities in sustainable finance market. And persistent gap in climate-related data can hinder the identification. So you can switch to the next slides. I'm going to give you a sense of what is the approach that we have followed. This is a very much a user-centric approach. The idea is to identify in a systematic way data needs of climate data needs in the financial sector. And so we build this on an extensive literature review. We had a number of bilateral outreach sections within the NGFS, outside of the NGFS for international financial institutions, like, I don't know, the FSB, the OECD, the World Bank, the BIS. We also distribute a survey that was to identify relevant stakeholder use cases. We also had 2 workshops with banks in February, as well as with buy-side firms, so pension fund, insurance company, sovereign wealth fund. And we have additional outreach sessions scheduled for the coming months, starting with non-financial corporates, rating agencies, data methodology provider. I think talking to corporates is the next step, and it's an important one because in some sense, corporates are at the beginning of the data chain, or climate data chain, right? So we start with the borrowers essentially, so corporates and household if you want. Then we have the lenders, which can be banks or non-bank financial institutions like asset manager companies, or it could be pension funds, insurance companies. Then we have investors. And so the idea of the report is to identify specific use cases, specific stakeholder, so we can essentially come up with a number of use cases directly related to these stakeholders. That would give us the data needs, then would allow us then to see what is available in terms of sources, and then again, implicitly that defines the data gap. And one way we're trying to do this is using a repository, which is essentially a collection of uses and availability. So next slide, please. So as I was mentioning, so essentially we identify stakeholder, or we identify use cases for this stakeholder, what metrics are available and what data items. And then we do this centering around this repository. And we're still in the discussion phase on like what to do in some sense with the repository once the report is out, right? Whether this is going to be a public utility in some sense, where it could be housed, in what form, how can we leverage what the private sector is doing, and how can we essentially engage with the private sector. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea, we have identified 6 stakeholder categories. So that goes from central bank, supervisor, credit institutions, essentially banks, insurer, pension funds, and other entities and investor. And then specifically 6 use cases that connect to the stakeholders. So whether this is about exposure quantification, investment and lending decisions, market economic modeling, financial stability modeling, for example, climate-related disclosure, as well as scenario analysis and stress testing. Next slide, please. One important point we want to make here that there is interconnectedness here between use cases, metrics, and raw data, right? And that's just a sense of commonality in the sense of use cases and data needs. And that's what we're trying to project here. So if you go from right to left, We go from different raw data type to metrics type, use case, and stakeholder. And you can see how all this, from the data all the way to the stakeholder, the extent of interconnectedness between the use cases and the data. And this, I think, where it's important because it allows us, in some sense, to come up with some sort of priorities, what we call the must-have data. And that's where we're going to be focusing in terms of the data gaps. Now, what have we learned so far? This is, first of all, it's a very crowded landscape, right? There's a lot of organization initiatives underway, going from public sector, international organization. I mentioned some already, FSB, ECFD, the BIS, the European Commission, IPSF. There are standard setters involved from IOSCO, IAIS, IFRS Foundation, long list of private sector initiatives, CDP, PRI, SASB, and I can continue with this. And what are the main challenges that we've found so far? One is that there are large data gaps for forward-looking data, right? For example, emission pathways, targets, forward-looking piece, I think that's where there are significant gaps. There's also limited availability in terms of granularity, availability and granularity of carbon data. Think about Scope 3 emissions, for example, as well as the geographical data of asset location. So how do I identify where assets are, where projects are? That it's important both for transition as well as digital risk. Then the other point is that the technology can help here, right? Whether this is about open source, whether this is about artificial intelligence to manage the data, what kind of system needs to be in place. Next slide, please. So how do we summarize all this? It goes from like data availability, as I mentioned, it's coverage, granularity, accessibility, to data reliability in terms of quality of the data, whether you can trust the data, so verificability and auditability of data, transparency in the provision of data, and then data comparability across sectors, across jurisdiction. That's the importance of having data labels and standard, and also taxonomies. So if you can go to the next slide, since it's one way to summarize all this up, how do we close this data gap? Next slide, please. Okay, so we identified essentially the approach we have taken is one of building blocks to bridge this data gap, and it's important that it's not, there is no one single policy here that actually can close the data gap, but it's important to have a mix of policy intervention that can catalyze progress and foster global convergence. The point that the word convergence here is very important, the way we look at data. We're trying to prevent, in some sense, the fragmentation, both at the policy level in terms of the regulatory jurisdiction, individual jurisdiction response, for example, as well as fragmentation in market, right? So if you want to use sustainable market to foster a green, sustainable recovery post-COVID, we need to avoid that there is fragmentation in market. Capital markets are global by nature now. And so how can we make sure that there is fast global convergence? So we have identified essentially three main blocks. One is that we need convergence toward a common and rapid set of global disclosure standards. That's important because one thing that you hear from corporates, for example, that they often have to report to different standards, reporting standards. So even if they have the right data, then they need to report following to different standards in the private sector. That makes their life much more complicated. So one point is about disclosure. The second building block is about taxonomy. I think we need to move toward some sort of minimally accepted global taxonomy. What I mean here by global taxonomy is essentially using the common language. Now, in some cases, there would be, thinking about the IPSF work, for example, the Commission and the Chinese taxonomy, there could be some sort of common ground taxonomy. In other cases where such taxonomies are missing, in the public sector, in other jurisdictions, it could be about principle. But there is a need to move some sort of minimally accepted taxonomy and definitions. There are more than 200 taxonomy out there if you look at both private and public sector. And then the point number three is the need for consistent metrics, label, and methodology of standard. So the idea here essentially is to avoid, for example, greenwashing, right? So we need to work toward a common set of well-defined and decision useful metrics. Now, to conclude, what's the next step in terms of the NGFS breaching the data gap? We will, as I said, continue to engage with stakeholders. The next step is non-financial corporates. Then we'll talk to data provider, methodology provider, and rating agencies, as well as central banks and international financial institution statistics department. And then again, the central point of the report is going to build around this repository, and we still have to do some thinking about what form the repository will take. But again, public utility, engage with the private sector, how to level technology that has been developed in the project. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Fabio. Very, very interesting, and I think it was very useful to have on one side the European strategy, and on your side to get basically the market expectation, at least the central bank's expectation on data. Very, very useful. I have a few questions. I'll just check if I have a question which is addressed to you before you go. There's no question addressed to you directly, Fabio. Question addressed to Simon and Daniele. About one question about the role of a blockchain to ensure data storage and accessibility. If you can tag that one question, and also how data holders can control both the way and whom can access to data personal information. This is not directly into the scope of the DG of the presentation, but I think it will be interesting to answer. If you can have a go, Simon or Daniele, on the first question.
Yes, on the first, so the role of smart contracts, yes, that was the...
or DLT and smart contract, yeah.
Yeah, so no, smart contracts is a, let's say, a relatively new topic when it comes to, I would say, legislation, but nevertheless, we try to integrate this into the Data Act, which is currently being elaborated. So we are looking at smart contracts as a promising way, maybe from a different angle. We are thinking that, or we see that some data holders are reluctant to share the data, to let commercial reusers access and use their data, because they are afraid that once they allow access, they will somehow lose control over the data. And I think that distributed ledger technology and the smart contracts are a good way of tracking what is happening with the data and of making sure that the conditions under which the data was made available are respected. So from that perspective, we are looking at finding a place, let's say, within this legislative initiative. Of course, I cannot say exactly at this point in time what it would be, but certainly we would need to tackle, I would say, at first, I guess, one of the main problems that we see with smart contracts nowadays is that there is still a lack of interoperability between the smart contracts across different blockchain solutions. So that is something that we need to tackle before we can seriously, let's say, recommend the use of smart contracts in data sharing transactions. But certainly it's something we're looking at.
Thank you. Just to make a connection with Fabio's point, I think very, very interesting and important points of Fabio's report is the need for a standard and the taxonomy to avoid the duplication of standards and the multiplication of data, basically. And we know there would not be any possibility to count biodiversity. There was not a taxonomy behind the biodiversity, and it's probably one of the most complex issue to count. Are you linking your strategy with the standard, with the European standardization strategy and the taxonomy?
Yes, indeed we are. So there is also a certain number of initiatives at European level. We have an annual standardization strategy. We are in constant contact with European standardization bodies. Activities regarding standardization of data will be included indeed in the next annual programs for standardization. We already do something internally, so you may know that the Publications Office is already managing a certain number of vocabularies. The taxonomy, now I am not an expert, so forgive me if I am saying something wrong, but there are also initiative partly legal, like Inspire, on this. But in general, trying to take into account the need for taxonomies as a way of implementing interoperability. This will also be something, at least taxonomies across domains. It's something that will be addressed by this support center for data sharing. Then each data space will also have to take care of seeing what kind of standards are already out and what are the needs for new or improved standards.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I will free you now. I know, Fabio, you have to leave. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much.
This presentation. Thank you very much, Daniele and Simon, for this outreach session. I think was extremely useful to all the audience to know better the developments, what has been done and what is cooking at the EU level. And I think you have an amazing and intense agenda to come. Thank you for that.